My name is Emily Hartley, and I am about to tell you how one carefully altered signature brought down the most powerful man in corporate America. Sign it, or I'll make sure no company in this city even takes your call. The sentence slithered from across the table, each word sharpened by contempt. As Richard Danvers, Chief Revenue Officer of Norbridge Holdings, pushed a pre-filled resignation letter toward me, I felt the weight of 3 years of silence crash into that moment. I signed it, but not the version he gave me. And what happened next would cost him his career, his freedom, and his legacy. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in Conference Room B, casting harsh shadows across Richard's angular face. His fingers drummed impatiently on the mahogany table as he waited for my response. Behind him, through the glass partition, I could see Marcus, the security guard, positioned strategically by the door. The message was clear: this wasn't a negotiation. "I've been more than patient with your performance issues, Emily," Richard continued, his voice dripping with false concern. "But the board has lost confidence. This is your chance to leave with dignity." I stared at the letter, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. 3 years of systematic harassment, credit theft, and deliberate sabotage had led to this moment. But Richard had made one crucial mistake. He underestimated me. "Of course," I said quietly, reaching for the pen. "I understand completely." As I signed, I caught Richard's satisfied smirk in my peripheral vision. He was already mentally celebrating, probably planning his victory drink. But he didn't see what I actually wrote. Where the letter stated, "voluntary resignation," I carefully altered it to read, "constructive dismissal due to executive coercion." Small changes, but legally explosive ones. "Thank you for confirming this meeting was at your request," I said, standing and slipping the letter into my briefcase before he could review it. "I'll make sure all relevant parties receive their copies." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, but his arrogance prevented him from questioning my words. That would be his second mistake. I wasn't always the woman who could stare down a corporate bully. 5 years ago, I was just another compliance officer trying to do the right thing in a system that rewarded the opposite. I'd grown up in small-town Oregon, where your word meant everything and hard work was its own reward. My parents ran a modest accounting firm, and I'd learned early that numbers never lied. People did. Norbridge Holdings had been different when I started. Under CEO Judith Caldwell, the company lived by its motto, "Integrity is profit." Judith was the kind of leader who remembered your birthday, who fought for ethical practices even when they cost money, who believed that doing right was more important than looking good. Then came the merger. The board brought in Richard Danvers to modernize revenue growth. He arrived with an MBA from Wharton, a track record of turning around struggling divisions, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. From day one, he treated the company like his personal kingdom and everyone else like subjects. My first real encounter with Richard's methods came during a routine audit review. I'd spent weeks investigating discrepancies in our client rebate program, discovering that several payments had been mysteriously rerouted. When I presented my findings to the senior team, Richard listened with apparent interest, nodding and asking thoughtful questions. 2 weeks later, at the quarterly board meeting, Richard presented his investigation into the rebate irregularities, claiming credit for uncovering the very issues I'd identified. When I tried to speak up, he cut me off with a patronizing smile. "Emily's been a great help with the preliminary work," he said, "but this required a more strategic approach." The board members nodded approvingly. After the meeting, Richard cornered me in the hallway. "You did solid work on that audit," he said, his voice low enough that others couldn't hear. "But presentation matters in this business. You understand." I understood perfectly. This was how it would be. Over the following months, Richard's campaign against me intensified. My team was gradually reassigned to other departments. Meeting invites mysteriously disappeared from my calendar. Reports I'd authored were rewritten and resubmitted under other names. When I complained to HR, I was told that communication issues were common during transitions and that I should try to be more collaborative. The isolation was calculated and effective. Colleagues who once sought my expertise suddenly found reasons to avoid me. Coffee invitations dried up. My office was moved to a lower floor, away from the executive suite where decisions were made. But Richard's biggest mistake was underestimating my attention to detail. While he was busy playing politics, I was quietly documenting everything, every altered report, every reassigned responsibility, every suspicious financial transaction. I'd learned in my small-town accounting days that paper trails don't lie, and I was building a case that would be impossible to ignore. The breakthrough came 6 months ago when I discovered the vendor contracts. Buried in routine procurement reports were agreements with companies I'd never heard of. TechFlow Solutions, Meridian Consulting, Strategic Dynamics. The contracts were small enough to avoid executive approval, but numerous enough to add up to millions. I spent weeks tracing the connections, following digital breadcrumbs through corporate registrations and tax filings. What I found made my blood run cold. Every vendor had ties to Coastal Enterprises, a holding company registered in Delaware. And Coastal Enterprises was owned by David Manning, Richard's college roommate. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity. Richard would approve contracts with Manning's companies for services that were either unnecessary or never performed. The payments were processed through legitimate channels, making them nearly impossible to track without knowing what to look for. Meanwhile, client rebates that should have been returned to customers were being redirected to cover the fraudulent contracts. I documented everything meticulously, creating a paper trail that would satisfy any auditor. But I knew that exposing Richard would require more than just evidence. It would require strategy. That's when I reached out to Darla Kessler. Darla was a legend in employment law circles, known for taking on corporate giants and winning. Her office was in a converted warehouse downtown, far from the gleaming towers where most white-collar attorneys practiced. When I explained my situation, she leaned back in her chair and smiled. "Corporate retaliation cases are like chess games," she said. "You have to think 3 moves ahead. They're going to try to discredit you, isolate you, and ultimately force you out. The question is, are you willing to play the long game?" I was. Darla's advice was counterintuitive. Don't fight back directly. Instead, let Richard escalate while documenting everything. Every missed meeting, every reassigned project, every performance review that contradicted years of positive evaluations. We were building a case for constructive dismissal, proving that my working conditions had become so intolerable that any reasonable person would be forced to quit. "He's going to push you to resign," Darla warned. "When he does, that's when we spring the trap." The trap was sprung on a Tuesday morning in March. My calendar had been updated overnight with a meeting request. Personnel discussion, conference room B, 10 Sacre a.m. No agenda, no attendees listed besides Richard and me. I arrived 5 minutes early, my briefcase containing copies of everything I'd documented over the past year. Richard was already there, looking pleased with himself in a way that made my skin crawl. "Close the door," he said without preamble. "We need to discuss your future with the company." I remained standing, my hand still on the door handle. "I'd prefer to leave it open. This is a private conversation. Emily, sit down." I sat, but left the door slightly ajar. Richard didn't notice. He was too focused on his performance. "I'll be direct," he began, sliding a manila folder across the table. "Your performance has been consistently below expectations. The board has lost confidence in your ability to fulfill your duties. We're prepared to offer you a generous severance package in exchange for your resignation." I opened the folder to find a resignation letter already prepared, complete with my name and title. The language was carefully crafted to make it appear voluntary while protecting the company from any legal liability. "I need time to consider this," I said. Richard's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the predator underneath. "Time isn't a luxury we can afford. This offer expires at the end of this meeting. And if I refuse, then we'll have to explore other options. Performance improvement plans, disciplinary actions, potential termination for cause. I'd hate to see your reputation in this industry suffer because of stubbornness." The threat hung in the air like smoke. I could see Marcus through the glass, his presence a not-so-subtle reminder that I was trapped, But Richard had made his fatal error. He'd created a paper trail of his own coercion. I understand the position you're putting me in, I said carefully. Let me make sure I'm clear on the terms. I pulled out a recorder, placing it on the table between us. Richard's eyes widened. What is that? Washington is a one-party consent state, I replied calmly. I have the right to record this conversation. Would you like to repeat your offer for the record? Richard's face went through several shades of red before settling on purple. Turn that off immediately. I'm simply trying to ensure we both understand the terms of this voluntary resignation, I said, emphasizing the last two words. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to characterize this meeting differently. For a moment, I thought Richard might explode. His hands clenched into fists, and I could see the veins in his neck bulging. But then his corporate training kicked in, and he forced himself to relax. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. But understand that this conversation stays between us. Any attempt to mischaracterize what happened here will be met with legal action. Of course, I agreed, turning off the recorder. Now, about this resignation letter. I read through the document again, making a show of considering each clause. Richard watched me like a hawk, his impatience growing with each passing minute. I'll sign it, I said finally. But I'd like to make one small amendment. What kind of amendment? Just a clarification about the circumstances, I said, pulling out a pen. Nothing that changes the substance. Richard leaned back in his chair, his relief evident. Go ahead. I made the changes quickly, altering key phrases while maintaining the appearance of minor edits. Where the letter stated voluntary resignation, I changed it to constructive dismissal due to executive coercion. I added the date and time of our meeting, along with a note about the presence of security personnel. There, I said, signing with a flourish. All done. Richard barely glanced at the document before sliding it into his folder. His arrogance had blinded him to the trap I'd just sprung. Thank you for handling this professionally, he said, standing to shake my hand. I'm sure you'll find success elsewhere. Thank you for confirming this meeting was at your request, I replied. My words, carefully chosen. I'll make sure all relevant parties receive their copies. I walked out of that conference room with my head high, knowing that Richard had just signed his own professional death warrant. The first call I made was to Darla. The second was to a courier service. By noon, copies of the altered resignation letter were in the hands of Norbridge's general counsel, the SEC's whistleblower division, and 3 major employment law firms. The response was immediate and devastating. Norbridge's legal team went into crisis mode. The general counsel, Patricia Moss, called an emergency meeting with the executive team. By 3 p.m., Richard was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. By 5 p.m., Darla had filed a formal complaint with the Department of Labor. The company's initial response was predictable: deny everything, claim the resignation was voluntary, and try to discredit me as a disgruntled employee. But they hadn't counted on the evidence I'd been gathering for months. Every email, every memo, every performance review that contradicted their narrative was cataloged and cross-referenced. Darla presented it all in a complaint that read like a legal thriller, complete with financial records showing the vendor fraud and audio recordings of Richard's increasingly desperate attempts to silence me. The media attention was swift and brutal. The business press loved a good corporate scandal, and the story of a compliance officer bringing down a corrupt executive was irresistible. Within days, Norbridge Holdings was trending on financial Twitter, and Richard's name was being mentioned alongside other disgraced corporate leaders. But the real victory came when other employees began speaking out. My complaint had given them permission to share their own stories of Richard's abuse. The company's whistleblower hotline was flooded with reports spanning 4 departments and 3 years. Maria Santos, a junior analyst, revealed how Richard had stolen her market research and presented it as his own. James Chen, a senior manager, documented how he'd been systematically excluded from meetings after questioning a questionable contract. Amy Johnson, a new hire, described how Richard had created a hostile work environment that drove her to consider leaving the industry entirely. Each story added another layer to the case against Richard, painting a picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond my individual experience. The investigation that followed was thorough and damning. The forensic audit uncovered $4.7 million in fraudulent contracts, all traced back to Richard's network of fake vendors. The SEC investigation revealed securities violations related to false financial reports. The Department of Labor found evidence of systematic retaliation against whistleblowers. The criminal charges came 3 months later. Richard was indicted on fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice charges. His arrest made the front page of the Wall Street Journal, complete with a photo of him in handcuffs being led away from his luxury apartment. But for me, the real victory wasn't Richard's downfall. It was the transformation of Norbridge Holdings itself. The board cleaned house, bringing in new leadership committed to ethical practices. They established an independent ethics office with direct reporting to the board. They implemented new whistleblower protections and mandatory training on harassment and retaliation. Most importantly, they offered me a new position, Chief Ethics Officer, with full access to the board and the authority to investigate any wrongdoing within the company. I accepted, but on my terms. No NDAs, no restrictions on speaking about my experience, and the right to publish the full story of what happened. The company agreed, understanding that transparency was the only way to rebuild trust. My new office was on the executive floor, with windows overlooking the city and a door that was always open to employees who needed to report concerns. On my desk sat a framed copy of the resignation letter I'd signed that day in Conference Room B, the document that had brought down Richard Danvers and transformed an entire company. The trial was a media circus. Richard's lawyers tried every trick in the book, claiming I was a vindictive employee, suggesting the evidence was fabricated, arguing that the contracts were legitimate business expenses. But the paper trail was overwhelming, and the jury saw through their desperate attempts to shift blame. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Richard was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $12 million in restitution. His professional reputation was destroyed, his assets seized, and his name became synonymous with corporate corruption. But the real change came in the months that followed. Other companies began implementing similar ethics programs, inspired by Norbridge's transformation. Industry associations developed new standards for whistleblower protection. Law schools added courses on corporate responsibility and employee rights. The story of how one altered signature brought down a corrupt executive became a case study in business schools across the country. I was invited to speak at conferences, to testify before Congress, to share my experience with other compliance officers facing similar challenges. The message was always the same: documentation is power, persistence pays off, and sometimes the smallest act of defiance can change everything. My life settled into a new rhythm. I loved my role as Chief Ethics Officer, working with employees to create a culture of integrity and accountability. The work was challenging but rewarding, and I felt like I was making a real difference. Richard, meanwhile, was serving his sentence at a minimum security federal prison in Oregon. I never visited him, never wrote to him, never thought about him except when his name came up in the news. He had become irrelevant to my life, a cautionary tale rather than a source of anger. The company thrived under its new leadership. Stock prices recovered and then soared as investors gained confidence in Norbridge's commitment to ethical practices. Employee satisfaction scores reached all-time highs. The company won awards for corporate responsibility and workplace excellence. I kept the resignation letter framed on my desk not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that standing up to bullies requires courage, that building a case requires patience, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply telling the truth. The letter was also a symbol of transformation, both mine and the company's. I had evolved from a quiet compliance officer into a corporate reformer, someone who could look powerful people in the eye and demand accountability. The company had evolved from a place where corruption could flourish into a model of ethical business practices. Years later, when young professionals ask me for advice on dealing with workplace harassment or corporate corruption, I would tell them the story of that resignation letter. I would explain how important it is to document everything, to build relationships with ethical colleagues, and to never underestimate the power of careful preparation. But most importantly, I would tell them that justice isn't about revenge. It's about preventing others from suffering the same fate. Richard's downfall wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter in corporate accountability. The signature I wrote that day in Conference Room B was more than just my name on a piece of paper. It was a declaration that I would not be silenced, would not be intimidated, and would not allow corruption to continue unchallenged. That signature changed everything, not just for me, but for every employee who came after. Every whistleblower who found the courage to speak up, every company that chose integrity over profit. It was, quite literally, the signature that changed corporate America. Today, as I look out my office window at the city below, I think about all the conference rooms where similar conversations are happening. Somewhere, a powerful executive is trying to intimidate an employee into silence. Somewhere, a whistleblower is documenting evidence of wrongdoing. Somewhere, someone is about to sign a document that will change their life forever. My message to them is simple. Be careful what you sign, because your signature has more power than you realize. Used wisely, it can bring down empires and build better worlds. Just ask Richard Danvers if you can find him in his prison cell. My name is Emily Hartley, and this is how one carefully altered signature brought down the most powerful man in corporate America and changed the business world forever.